A father and son killed outside their rural home.
It's a bloodbath.
The minute I open the car, I can smell a flammable liquid.
The house had been burglarized back in 2017.
This seemed to be a targeted attack.
Promising leads quickly unravel.
Their wallets were missing, but there was no burglary of the home. No broken windows, no kicked-in doors.
It was pretty obvious somebody wanted us to believe that it was a robbery.
When detectives track down the gunman, their investigation takes an unexpected turn, exposing a betrayal that leaves a close-knit Christian community in shock.
He said that he was hired to do the job.
There was a text message. She said, yes, that was sort of our code.
Do what? You really want to play stupid? I'm serious now.
She offered him $20,000 to commit that murder.
It didn't sound right to me. I was in complete shock. How could they possibly think that she had done this?
August 18th, 2018. It's just before noon in Horry County, South Carolina, and police are responding to reports of a burned-out vehicle abandoned in a soybean field.
It was unusual because, here's this car sitting in the middle of their field. They had no idea how it had gotten there.
All the doors were closed. It was obvious that the windows were covered in soot from the inside. So the initial officer that arrived opened the door just to see if anybody was inside. Nobody was in the vehicle, but somebody attempted to burn the vehicle.
He ran the license plate through dispatch, got the owner's name and address, and that was Robbie Ford.
They come up with an address roughly 15 to 17 miles away in Conway. They send an officer to the house. It's a residence owned by Mr. Robert Ford, Robbie's father.
The house is in the rural section of Horry County. It's mainly family farms. It's not very populated.
The officer goes there, knocks on the front door, gets no response, attempts to walk around to the back of the house.
He looked to his right and saw a male body laying outside the back door. He saw another male body laying on the grassy area.
The officer checks for signs of life, but both men are dead from apparent gunshot wounds. The older victim appears to be Robert Ford, and the younger one, his son Robbie.
They both shared the same name, Robbie, and then Robert's the dad. It's a bloodbath. Something really bad has happened.
The officer immediately called for assistance, homicide, supervisors, all hands on deck. There was no burglary of the home. The door was still locked when law enforcement got there. There was no broken windows, no kicked-in doors.
So investigators start asking themselves, is there something about either of these victims that would cause someone to target them? So they're really looking to who would have a motive to kill them.
Initial background checks show that Robert Marion Ford was born on May 21st, 1959, in Conway, South Carolina.
Robert was a native of the area, lifelong resident. He was very active in his church, very active in the choir.
He was married to a lady named Sheila. Sheila and Robert had a daughter named Samantha.
Samantha was always the apple of his eye. She had a great relationship with her dad. She loved both her parents very much.
The relationship between Robert and Sheila was strained. So they had gotten a divorce. They saw each other from time to time, but it was a very chilled relationship.
Once he and Samantha's mother divorced, Robert quickly married Melda, who was Robbie's mother. So Samantha and Robbie were half siblings. It seemed as though the family was pretty close, pretty well adjusted. Samantha grew up with her mother, but would certainly visit with her father on a regular basis.
Robbie was always the typical annoying kid brother. Not that Samantha ever treated him like she was annoyed with him or anything. She spent time with him. She loved him.
As Samantha and Robbie got older, Robert worked hard to support them.
He had been a very hard worker, studiously saving money so that he could provide for his children.
Robert also invested in his children's spiritual growth.
He played leadership roles in the church. He was a constant member of the choir, and he went several times a week. So everyone in the community knew Robert, and they all knew Samantha. They all knew Robbie.
But Robert's devotion to the church was challenged when 21-year-old Samantha came to him with some difficult news.
She got pregnant out of wedlock. He wasn't happy about the situation, but he didn't fault her. But the church frowned upon it, even though she has been involved in the church her entire life. Her father had to step down as deacon because she's an unwed mother.
To Robert, the decision was simple. When Samantha gave birth to her daughter, he was there for her, despite the scandal it caused in the congregation.
He had a grandchild, so in ways their relationship was strengthened.
He was an amazing grandfather. He loved his kids. He's Pappy.
Within a few years, Samantha gave birth to twin boys, but her relationship with the children's father didn't last. However, when she met and married a man who worked at the nearby detention center, Samantha found the stability her children needed.
He had adopted her 3 biological children that she had from someone else. Samantha maybe did some work here or there, but nothing steady.
She was always involved with her children. She stayed at home a lot with the kids.
While Samantha settled into family life, Robbie was building a life of his own.
Robbie was also very highly thought of. He had been in school at Clemson studying for an architecture degree and seemed at least on the path to a good career.
He had a good relationship with his niece and nephews. Still had a really good relationship with Samantha. They talked regularly.
But in 2016, the family faced heartbreak when Robert's wife Melda suddenly died. Over the next 2 years, Robbie and Samantha became his support system as he dealt with the grief.
It was just Robbie and Robert living at the home when Robbie was not in college.
There were quite a number of text messages. They would spend time with each other, visit with each other. So at first blush, the family certainly seemed very close.
But on the evening of August 18th, 2018, both Robert and Robbie have been found shot to death outside their home. Shortly after the discovery, Detective Peter Sester arrives to begin an investigation.
We've got a young male. He has what appears to be a gunshot wound in his upper right shoulder and a gunshot wound to the back of the head. The second victim, and that would be Robbie's father, Robert Ford. His gunshot wound is a contact wound under the chin. They had some to-go cups with them, maybe some leftover food or something in a bag with them. So they are just peacefully coming in. You begin to think, okay, Robert Ford had to have been shot first because there is no indication of a struggle. That tells me the suspect's standing right there and waiting for them. Robbie Ford is probably attempting to flee from the back of the house when he's shot more than likely in the upper right shoulder first. That puts him to the ground. The second shot is then the suspect coming up behind him and shooting him in the back of the head. At close range, you could see that blood is coagulating. It's beginning to turn darker. I've got to assume it's probably anywhere from 6 to 12 hours earlier that this occurred. Both of the wallets were gone. One of the cars is in the driveway, and obviously the other vehicle that's in the farming field belongs to this residence.
A robbery attempt seems possible, but a search of the home quickly dismisses that theory.
The neighbors were probably about 2 football fields away. This seemed to be a targeted attack in part because someone went specifically to that location in a very rural area. That suggests that they had some knowledge of who lived there or what they might find there.
Both of these two individuals are quiet, law-abiding citizens. The father is a good church-going man, and Robbie's looking forward to going off to school in Charleston. The fact that the father is shot up close and personal, you can't help but think this is a close friend or a relative that's behind this murder.
The initial questions would be, do they have any enemies? Who would want to do this? Who gains from their death?
Coming up, detectives get a lead from something the killer left behind.
Cigarette butts are a perfect source of DNA.
And an insight into the killer's mindset is revealed.
A mask shows that this was not spur of the moment. This was planned out.
To South Carolina police, the murders of 59-year-old Robert Ford and his 25-year-old son, Robbie Ford, appear to be the result of a targeted attack. But it seems the killer tried to make it look otherwise.
Their wallets were missing. Robbie's vehicle was missing. But it looks like a homicide made to look like a robbery gone bad.
This crime appears to be committed solely on these two individuals. That's telling us that we need to be looking for somebody that may be closely connected to these victims.
News of something happening at the Ford home gets back to loved ones quickly.
Samantha did show up at the scene. It's my understanding that people had called to tell her there was a law enforcement presence at her father and brother's house.
She approached law enforcement. They told her your father and half-brother had been killed.
She seemed pretty shocked about the whole incident. Kind of a normal reaction you would expect from a daughter.
They began asking, when's the last time you heard from them? Do you know what they had been doing recently? And Samantha told investigators that Robert and Robbie had been down in Charleston looking for an apartment for Robbie, who was going to be spending a semester of school down there.
She communicated with them the night before and knew that they would be arriving back on Saturday.
She described her relationship with her father as an excellent relationship. They were very close. She would go and clean his house, bring them meals. She could not think of anyone who would want to harm either her father or her brother.
According to Samantha, the only trouble her father had in the recent past is a break-in.
The house had been burglarized back in 2017, and several items had been taken from the house at that time.
During that burglary, a .38 revolver was stolen, some jewelry, and a laptop.
To investigators, It seems unlikely the burglars would return a year later and not steal anything. They leave Samantha to grieve and make arrangements to follow up with her.
They canvassed the neighborhood and they went to one of the closest neighbors who was kind of across the field. The night before, around 8:45, that neighbor was outside in his yard and heard a gunshot, followed by a scream and another gunshot. He didn't report that to the police at the time because in that area of our county, hearing gunshots is not particularly unusual.
The timing corresponds to what Samantha told investigators. Detective Sestaire directs his attention to the soybean field where Robert's car was abandoned.
This is significant because whoever brought that vehicle there decided that they were going to try and destroy evidence by setting the vehicle on fire. I arrive on scene. You're looking for any type of evidence. I find nothing until I get within about 5 to 10 feet of the vehicle. And just outside the driver's door of the vehicle on the ground, there are 3 cigarette butts that are smoked down almost to the filter. The minute I open the car, I can smell a flammable liquid, gasoline or something of that nature. I also see inside the vehicle, and I think is significant, is on the driver's side floor, there's like a wool ski cap.
When people set out to burn a car, they don't realize that the car has to have a lot of oxygen to continue the burn.
The killer, he didn't roll any windows down or crack a window, so the fire quickly smothered.
Detective Sestaire collects the pieces of evidence and reseals the car to preserve the crime scene.
Cigarette butts are a perfect source of DNA. Skin cells, saliva from your mouth is on the filters of those cigarettes. So that's going to definitely yield a significant profile for us on who our killer may be.
While the crime lab begins analysis of the DNA samples, investigators consider the other evidence left behind.
A mass shows that this was not spur of the moment. This was planned out.
With the investigation underway, the shocking news spreads across the small community.
Robert Ford's family was horrified that he had been murdered and really wanted some justice.
Samantha was completely devastated. She didn't even know, up from down at that moment. They told her they couldn't rule her out at that point. We just assumed that was typical protocol.
But when investigators contact Samantha to give a statement, she provides an airtight alibi.
There was a convenience store that showed Samantha on surveillance video during the time of the murders. The investigators also got Samantha's phone records. There was no evidence that her phone was using a cell tower near her father's home.
A few weeks later, the DNA samples collected from the burned vehicle provide detectives with a possible new lead.
The State Law Enforcement Division, SLED, determines that both the cigarette butts and the skull cap had the same single-source DNA profile. That's like gold in an investigation because it's one person.
I vividly remember there was celebration. We don't know everything, but we fully expected the killer to be in CODIS.
It's been 30 days since the murders of Robert and Robbie Ford, and Horry County investigators have just gotten a huge break in the case.
The DNA profile is that of a white male. We're excited. We're thinking the minute they load that thing into CODIS, we're going to get a hit. This person's got to be in there.
Unfortunately, CODIS did not come back with what we call a hit, so it didn't lead anywhere at that point.
But we now have that it is a white male.
Experts suggest detectives send the samples to a company specializing in ancestral DNA.
You can't DNA everybody. It's a violation of people's privacy. But we'll pay ourselves to send our DNA into 23andMe and all these other companies. Well, the one thing they don't tell you when you sent your DNA off through the mail is through forensic genealogy, law enforcement can have access to it.
That takes time. It was a lot of hard investigative work that went into this, patience, and the longer it takes you, the fear of memories, of evidence, of things happening to people that they're not going to be around later on.
As the months pass, Samantha Rabon moves on with her life.
I had gone to her home, which was formerly her father's home. Her and her husband and her kids moved into it.
Samantha Rabon acted pretty quickly in laying claim to Robert's assets and to any money that was available to her. And I think that certainly got investigators' attention, that she was behaving so quickly. Police found out from Robert Ford's sister that he had insurance policies and that Samantha Rabon was the beneficiary of those policies. But Robbie was actually the primary beneficiary.
Robert had a lot of insurance, and he had a lot of land. So if anything were to happen to Robert, Robbie would get that money.
I know that afterwards she was obtaining money from various insurance policies after her dad and brother had been murdered, and she was renovating her home. So she was benefiting from her father and brother's death for sure.
In August 2020, 2 years after the murders, the DNA lab contacts detectives.
They come back with a partial match. Our suspect has 2 other brothers, and that's great information. And they're both incarcerated, so their DNA was collected in jail. Problem is, they weren't out of jail, so it's definitely not them. But from that, we then develop a potential suspect, and that's Randy Granger. Turns out that he has a criminal history. He had been in prison for, I believe, about 15 years.
Data obtained from the cell tower near the burned vehicle puts Randy in the area when the crime took place.
They discovered a phone number associated with Randy Granger as making a phone call to somebody else on this night. And that phone number came back to a woman named Teresa Martin. Randy Granger and Teresa Martin were dating, boyfriend and girlfriend. Teresa Martin, once investigators start looking into her, is discovered to be a distant relative of Samantha Rabon's mother. She is a cousin. Of course, it raises eyebrows that Randy Granger, whose DNA is at the soybean field, is calling the cousin of Samantha Rabon on the night that her father and her brother have been murdered.
Coming up, a co-conspirator makes a confession.
When he was done with the job, she gave him $20,000.
And exposes the puppet master.
He said that he was hired
To do what?
to kill her daddy.
Nearly 2 years after Robert Ford and his son Robbie Ford were found murdered, South Carolina police interview 2 new suspects. A relative of Samantha Rabon, Teresa Martin, and Teresa's boyfriend, 50-year-old Randy Granger.
They're brought in and placed in separate rooms and questioned.
We know he was involved. So even at that point, we've got to get a story as to why this happened. Going into it, it's like, what is your connection with these 2?
Randy is confronted with photos of the burned vehicle and items containing his DNA.
Mr. Randy, do you have any idea why you're here? No? What's that?
It's a Ford Escape.
You ain't never seen it? You ain't never seen it before? No. Okay.
It's a cigarette butt with DNA on it. It was left right beside the car.
Randy wouldn't say anything about anything.
I know you didn't do this by yourself, but I want is the person who asked you to do it. Do what? You really want to play stupid? I'm serious now. Because I got you right now for at least 2 counts of murder. Arson. Only a lawyer, I guess.
Hitting a brick wall with Randy, detectives hope Teresa will give them more.
Just because you know something doesn't mean you're involved in it. Doesn't mean you can be in trouble for it. But by lying to us, that's where a problem comes. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
At first, Teresa sidesteps their questions about Randy, but she eventually admits he called her to pick him up on the day of the murders.
And what did he say?
Nothing. He just got in the car and he said, let's go home.
As police continued to interview her, she engaged in what we call progressive truth-telling. She kept giving them just a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more.
He said that he was hired to do a job.
And he said, who hired him?
He said Samantha.
To do what?
To kill her daddy.
Okay.
About a week before the murders, Teresa says she overheard Randy and Samantha discussing the plan.
She told him that, like I said, she had a job for him to do, and I wanted to take care of my daddy and my brother. When he was done with the job, she'd give him $20,000. And she wanted it done before he left to go to college, because she knew if just her daddy got killed, then she would have to split everything.
Robbie was actually the primary beneficiary, so it wouldn't have done Samantha much good to kill her father if her brother didn't die at the same time.
Then she is the sole beneficiary of all assets. Those assets include pension plans, life insurance, lots of acreage that her father's home was on, including the home, all these assets up to almost $1 million.
So how did he get to Robert's house?
Well, I took him and dropped him off. He told me that he got the gun from Samantha. He said he's going to wait in the woods until they come home.
You remember what time?
It wasn't dark yet.
There was a text message from Teresa Martin to Samantha Rabon, "I'm home alone." They confronted her with that. At first, she denied that it meant anything. Eventually, she said, yes, that was sort of our code, that I had dropped Randy off.
The interview gives detectives what they need to secure an arrest warrant for Samantha. She is immediately arrested at her mother's residence.
They actually timed Samantha's arrest for the 2-year anniversary of the murders. Samantha Rabon was initially charged with murder and criminal conspiracy.
News of the alleged murder plot stuns everyone in the community.
I heard all these rumors, but I took it with a grain of salt because it didn't sound right to me. This is not the young lady that I've grown to know.
I was in complete shock when they arrested her. How could they possibly think that she had done this?
Once Samantha's arrested, she doesn't talk. She doesn't claim to be involved in any way, shape, form, or fashion.
Before I ask you any questions, just want you to know, I already talked to Randy. And Randy's in jail. Okay? Do you want to talk to us?
No. So how does my lawyer come here? Like, what happened to them?
Now with a warrant, police obtain Samantha's cell phone. Investigators turn it over to a detective who specializes in electronic crimes.
I deal with anything that has digital evidence. I got the cell phone. I began using keyword searches and searching for insurance. I began murder and different search criterias to go through the device.
Some of the more interesting web searches were how quickly you can clean up a double homicide. How quickly can you get a passport?
There were other searches. Does God forgive murderers? Can you be a suspect in a murder and never get charged?
There is a lot of real damning search history that really feeds in to the fact that she has played a significant role in the death of her father and her brother.
After 2 years of investigation, Samantha Rabon has been charged with plotting a murder for hire to get rid of her father and brother. Once the case is handed over to prosecutors, they focus on getting Samantha's co-conspirators to turn against her.
Teresa Martin had basically admitted some of her involvement, and she quickly agreed to cooperate. Randy Granger would not, so I determined that it was easier to try him first.
On April 3rd, 2023, Teresa pleads guilty to being an accessory.
Teresa Martin never goes to trial, takes a plea, and agrees to testify in both Randy and Samantha Rabon's trials.
The same day she takes a plea, she provides witness testimony at Randy's trial.
The police get what we call a buccal swab, a known DNA standard from him. That DNA standard is sent to SLED, and SLED is able to say, yes, that DNA standard matches the single-source DNA profile from the cigarette butts and the ski cap at the scene.
Randy Granger is found guilty and sentenced to 2 life terms for the murder of Robert and Robbie Ford.
After his conviction of 2 counts of murder, arson, and other charges, Randy has a change of heart.
Randy, at that point, agreed to testify against Samantha Rabon.
According to Randy, Samantha's relationships with her father and brother weren't as rosy as police had been led to believe.
Samantha was the child of a previous marriage, whereas Robbie had grown up with both of his parents in the same home. So I think there was a little bit of tension there because Robbie may have been perceived as being the favored child in the family dynamic.
There was talk about Samantha being unhappy about Robbie maybe getting a little more inheritance than she did.
Randy says Samantha approached him at her mother's house with a plan to profit off their deaths.
Randy Granger said that Samantha Rabon gave him the gun that day on the porch. She said that they both had to die at the same time, and she offered him $20,000 to commit that murder.
About a week later, Randy and Teresa executed the plan.
Teresa Martin dropped Randy off at Robert and Robbie Ford's home. Randy Granger waited hours and hours and smoked cigarettes while he was waiting for them to come home. He knew that they were going to be at dinner. He just didn't know exactly when they would get home.
Around 8:45 p.m., he heard tires on the gravel driveway.
Robert got out of the passenger side of Robbie's car first and was walking to go up the back steps to his home. And he shot Robert Ford in the face. Randy says he hears Robbie scream, and he is running, and so he shoots Robbie in the back. And then he goes over and shoots Robbie in the back of the head. He walks back over to Robert and shoots him under his chin. And he takes their wallet, and he takes the keys to the Ford Escape that was Robbie's. And he drives it to a field, and he attempts to burn it.
Once the car was on fire, Randy called Teresa to pick him up. But he'd made a few crucial mistakes.
He had smoked basically a pack of cigarettes, and then he put the cigarettes in his socks to keep from leaving evidence there.
He didn't realize that his socks had rolled down and the cigarettes he'd been stashing from Robert's house had fallen outside the car onto the ground. And he thought that the skull cap would have burned up, but they didn't.
The intent was to completely destroy the vehicle. He just neglected to leave a window open to allow oxygen to get into it.
After the double homicide, Randy found out it was all for nothing.
He never received $20,000 from Samantha Rabon. Randy was upset at first, but you can't call the police.
With Randy and Teresa's help, prosecutors believe they have enough to convict Samantha. But they know when it comes to juries, a guilty verdict is never certain.
I think the strongest thing that we had going for us was a clear motive. But anytime you are dependent on a testifying co-defendant, you always worry because it's very easy cross-examination for the defense attorney. What you're doing is to get a better deal. They have a built-in motive to fabricate. So there was a lot of pressure on us to get the right result.
On February 21st, 2024, Samantha Rabon stands trial for the murders of her family members, Robert and Robbie Ford.
It was a full 6 years after we discovered that gruesome scene off Highway 19, so way past due.
For Samantha's trial, the whole victim side of the courtroom was packed with family, with friends. There were still some supporters for Samantha Rabon on her side, including her husband and some other family members.
Prosecutors rely heavily on Randy Granger's testimony.
I will say I thought Randy's testimony was extremely effective. It had a ring of truth to it that you couldn't deny.
They argue the burglary at the Ford home, during which the murder weapon was stolen, is evidence of premeditation.
It does seem that Samantha Rabon was certainly responsible for that burglary, which shows us that she had been thinking about having her father killed and her brother killed for at least a year before and was actually going to use her father's own gun to do it.
Samantha finally reached a breaking point. Her income was not meeting her outgo, and I think she snapped because there was a solution And that solution to make her a millionaire was going to cost her her dad and her brother.
Samantha's defense team attempts to undermine Randy's credibility.
The defense, of course, is going to paint a cooperating state's witness, a man that admits to pulling the trigger, as not to be trusted.
Randy Granger did tell us what he had done with the gun. He said that he threw it into sort of a creek running along a road, but we were never able to find the gun.
Samantha Rabon was adamant that she didn't do it, and that just because she benefited, I'm sure she probably thought that doesn't mean I'm a murderer.
On February 28, 2024, after 2 hours, the jury reaches a decision.
When he said that she was guilty, inside I was screaming and crying and having a complete breakdown.
She was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole and was taken away that day.
I still don't understand. I'm just still so overwhelmed and lost in the feeling of there's no true factual evidence that I can see.
100% justice was served. She is the one that set this plan in motion, and she is where she belongs.
Although the gunman, Randy Granger, helped prosecutors convict Samantha, he doesn't fare much better.
The state filed a motion asking a judge to allow him to be resentenced, but the judge only turned it from 2 consecutive life terms to 2 concurrent life terms, so not much of a break for him in the end.
I know there was a huge sense of relief for Robert's family and for that community where Robert lived. He was extremely active in his church and had a lot of friends out there, and I think they were relieved to finally see some justice in this case.
Who would want to think that anyone in their family would have the ability to draft up a plan like this, to have somebody executed simply over money? Samantha felt she needed it all. Greed got the better end of her.
The soybean field stretched out like a silent ocean under the late summer sun, its green rose swaying gently in the humid air, giving no hint that something violent had passed through it just hours before. From a distance, the vehicle looked like a mistake, an object that didn't belong, abandoned in the middle of nowhere where only tractors and the occasional pickup truck should ever roam. But as the patrol car approached, gravel crunching beneath its tires before giving way to uneven dirt, the illusion broke apart. The vehicle was scorched, its once glossy surface dulled into a charred shell, windows blackened from within, as though the fire had tried to claw its way out but failed. The smell hit before the officer even opened his door, a sharp, unmistakable scent of gasoline hanging stubbornly in the heat, clinging to the air like a warning that had come too late. He paused for a moment, one hand resting on the frame of his cruiser, scanning the emptiness around him. No movement, no witnesses, just acres of farmland and a car that someone had clearly wanted to erase from existence. When he finally stepped closer, the quiet felt heavier, pressing in from all sides. The doors of the vehicle were closed, the windows coated in soot from the inside, a sign that whatever fire had been started had suffocated before it could finish its work. He reached for the handle, hesitating only briefly before pulling it open. The interior smelled even stronger, burnt fabric mixed with fuel, the residue of something rushed and incomplete. There was no body inside, no immediate sign of a victim, but the absence itself felt wrong. People didn't abandon cars like this in the middle of fields without a reason, and they certainly didn't try to burn them unless they were hiding something far worse. He stepped back, radio already in hand, calling it in with a voice that remained steady out of habit, even as his instincts told him this was only the beginning of something much darker. The license plate led to a name, Robbie Ford. Dispatch returned an address roughly 15 miles away, in a quieter part of Horry County where homes sat far apart and neighbors measured distance, not in steps, but in acres. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where evenings were marked by the hum of insects and the distant echo of gunfire that meant nothing more than someone hunting or practicing. The officer didn't know it yet, but that sense of normalcy, the idea that nothing truly bad could happen in a place like that, was about to be shattered. When he arrived at the property, the stillness felt familiar at first. A modest home sat back from the road, framed by open land and bordered by trees that cast long shadows across the yard. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows or splintered doors. Everything looked intact, almost peaceful. He approached the front door and knocked, waiting for movement inside that never came. No footsteps, no voices, just silence stretching longer than it should. He circled around the side of the house, boots brushing against dry grass, his attention sharpening with each step. Something wasn't right. The absence of sound, of life, began to feel deliberate, as though the house itself was holding its breath. And then he saw it. A body lay near the back door, motionless, positioned in a way that immediately told him there would be no need to check for a pulse, though training compelled him to do it anyway. The man's skin had already begun to lose its warmth, his form stiffening under the weight of time that had passed unnoticed. A second body lay further out on the grass, the distance between them telling a story that hadn't yet been spoken aloud but was already taking shape in the officer's mind. Gunshot wounds. Close range. No signs of struggle. This wasn't chaos. This was execution. The radio call this time carried urgency. Backup. Homicide. Everyone. Within minutes, the quiet rural property transformed into a controlled storm of activity. Vehicles lined the dirt road, lights flashing against the stillness of the afternoon, officers moving with purpose as they secured the scene. The air grew thick, not just with the lingering heat of August, but with the weight of what had happened there. Two men, a father and his son, lying dead just steps from their home. It was the kind of scene that didn't belong in a place like this, and yet it had happened anyway, precise and deliberate. Detectives would later reconstruct those final moments, but even in the earliest stages, the story began to form through the smallest details. There were takeout cups nearby, a bag that suggested they had just returned from a meal, perhaps something ordinary, something forgettable. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, no overturned furniture or broken glass. Whoever had done this hadn't needed to break in. They had been waiting, watching, knowing exactly when their targets would arrive. The older man, Robert Ford, appeared to have been shot first. The wound beneath his chin indicated close contact, the kind that required proximity, confidence, and a chilling lack of hesitation. There was no defensive posture, no sign that he had seen it coming in time to react. The younger man, Robbie, told a different part of the story. A wound to his shoulder suggested movement, an attempt to flee that had been cut short. The final shot, delivered to the back of his head, left no doubt about the outcome. This wasn't random violence. It was controlled, methodical, and deeply personal. As investigators moved through the property, one question surfaced again and again, threading through every observation. Why? There was no immediate answer. The house hadn't been ransacked. Valuables remained untouched. Doors were still locked. If this had been a robbery, it was a poorly executed one, or more likely, a staged attempt to mislead. The missing wallets raised suspicion, but they felt almost like an afterthought, a detail added to create a narrative that didn't quite hold together under scrutiny. Neighbors, sparse as they were, offered little more than fragments. One recalled hearing gunshots the night before, 2 distinct cracks, followed by what might have been a scream. But in a place where gunfire wasn't unusual, it hadn't raised alarm at the time. Now, in hindsight, those sounds carried a different weight, transforming from background noise into the final echoes of 2 lives ending. Back at the soybean field, the burned vehicle took on new significance. It wasn't just abandoned, it was part of the plan. An attempt to destroy evidence, to sever the connection between the crime and whoever had committed it. But it had failed. The fire hadn't consumed everything. It had been rushed, incomplete, leaving behind traces that would soon become critical. The smell of gasoline lingered, stubborn and revealing. Inside, a wool ski cap sat on the floor, out of place and untouched by the flames that had tried to erase it. And outside, scattered near the driver's side door, were cigarette butts, small, easily overlooked, but carrying within them something far more valuable than anything that had been taken from the victims. DNA. The kind of evidence that didn't rely on memory or interpretation, that spoke in certainty where human accounts could falter. Each cigarette filter held traces of the person who had been there, who had waited, who had watched the fire fail to do its job. It was a mistake, one of several that would later unravel a plan built on greed and desperation. But in those first hours, standing between a burned car in an empty field and two bodies outside a quiet home, investigators didn't yet see the full picture. They only knew that something calculated had taken place, something that reached beyond random violence into the realm of intent. Someone had chosen that location. Someone had known those victims. Someone had waited in the shadows for the right moment, then stepped forward and ended two lives with precision that spoke of planning, not impulse. And somewhere beyond the edges of that crime scene, beyond the flashing lights and the murmured conversations, the truth waited, hidden behind layers of deception, buried beneath assumptions that would soon begin to crumble. Because this wasn't just a story about a father and a son found dead in a quiet corner of South Carolina. It was a story about betrayal, about the kind of darkness that doesn't come from strangers, but from within the very circles we trust the most. And as the investigation began to unfold, that truth would reveal itself piece by piece, each discovery more unsettling than the last, until the question was no longer just who committed the crime, but how far someone was willing to go, and what they believed they stood to gain, by destroying the very people who had once been closest to them. Horry County was the kind of place where time didn't rush, it lingered. The roads stretched long and narrow between patches of farmland, bending gently around fields of soybeans and tobacco, past weathered barns and modest homes that had stood for decades. In the late summer of 2018, the air hung thick with humidity, the kind that clung to your skin and made every movement feel slower, heavier. Cicadas filled the afternoons with their constant hum, and as evening approached, the sound of crickets would take over, blending into a quiet rhythm that defined life in this rural corner of South Carolina. It was a place where people knew each other by name, where church pews filled with familiar faces every Sunday, and where tragedy, real, deliberate violence, felt like something that belonged somewhere else. The Ford property sat tucked into this landscape, surrounded by open land that stretched far beyond the reach of the house itself. It wasn't grand, but it was solid, built with the kind of practicality that came from years of hard work and careful planning. The gravel driveway curved gently toward the house, crunching under tires in a way that always announced someone's arrival long before they reached the front door. Behind the home, the land opened into a wide expanse of grass and trees, offering both privacy and isolation. It was the kind of place where you could stand outside at night and see nothing but darkness stretching in every direction, broken only by the distant glow of a neighbor's porch light far across the fields. Robert Marion Ford had spent his entire life rooted in this environment. Born on May 21, 1959, in Conway, he wasn't just a resident of Horry County, he was part of its fabric. The people here didn't just know him, they recognized him as someone dependable, someone steady. He was the kind of man who showed up when he said he would, who shook hands firmly and looked people in the eye when he spoke. His life had followed a path that, to outsiders, might seem simple, but to those who lived it, carried its own quiet weight. He worked hard, saved carefully, and built a life not around excess, but around stability. Faith played a central role in who Robert was. The church wasn't just a place he attended, it was where he invested his time, his energy, and a large part of his identity. He sang in the choir, his voice blending into hymns that echoed through the sanctuary week after week. He took on leadership roles, stepping forward when responsibility called, guiding others not with force, but with consistency. People trusted him, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it over years of showing up, of being present, of living in a way that aligned with the values he spoke about. His family life, however, carried complexities that weren't always visible from the outside. Robert had been married to Sheila, and together they had a daughter, Samantha. For a time, their lives followed the expected pattern: raising a child, building a home, sharing responsibilities. But relationships, even in the most grounded environments, don't always hold. The marriage eventually broke down, ending in divorce. It wasn't explosive or dramatic in the way some separations are described. Instead, it left behind a quiet distance, a relationship that cooled rather than shattered. They remained in contact, crossing paths occasionally, but whatever closeness had once defined them no longer existed in the same way. Samantha, their daughter, grew up largely with her mother, but her connection to her father never disappeared. She visited regularly, moving between two worlds that, while separate, were still connected by family ties. To Robert, she was more than just his child. She was a point of pride, someone he cared for deeply, even as life grew more complicated around them. After his divorce, Robert didn't remain alone for long. He remarried, this time to a woman named Melda, and together they had a son, Robbie. This created a blended family dynamic. Samantha and Robbie were half-siblings, connected by blood but raised under different circumstances. Despite that, the bond between them developed in a way that felt natural. Robbie, younger and energetic, often took on the role of the typical little brother, the one who followed, who annoyed in small, harmless ways. But Samantha never pushed him away. She spent time with him, included him, treated him not as an obligation, but as family in the truest sense. As the years passed, Robert worked tirelessly to provide for both of his children. He wasn't a man of extravagance, but he was disciplined. He saved money, planned for the future, and ensured that his children had opportunities he may not have had himself. His efforts weren't limited to financial support. He invested in their upbringing, particularly in their spiritual lives. Church wasn't optional, it was part of who they were, a foundation that shaped their values and their sense of community. From the outside, the Ford family appeared close, stable, and grounded. They attended church together, participated in community life, and maintained relationships that extended beyond their immediate household. But even in families that seem strong, moments arise that test those bonds in unexpected ways. For Robert, one of those moments came when Samantha was in her early 20s. She approached him with news that would ripple through both their family and their community. She was pregnant, and she wasn't married. In a place where faith and tradition carried significant weight, this wasn't just personal, it was public. The church, which had been such a central part of their lives, didn't respond with quiet acceptance. There was judgment, subtle and overt, and it extended beyond Samantha to Robert himself. He wasn't pleased with the situation, but his response revealed something deeper about his character. He didn't turn away from his daughter. He didn't abandon her or treat her as a source of shame. Instead, he stood by her, even as it cost him his position within the church. He stepped down from his role as a deacon, a decision that carried both personal and social consequences. For Robert, however, the choice was clear. Family came first. When Samantha gave birth to her daughter, the dynamic between father and daughter shifted. The tension that had once existed gave way to something stronger. Robert embraced his role as a grandfather with a kind of quiet joy, investing time and affection into his grandchild. The bond between him and Samantha deepened, not despite the circumstances, but because of how they had navigated them together. In the years that followed, Samantha's life continued to evolve. She had more children, twin boys, and while her relationships with her father didn't last, she eventually found stability through marriage to a man who worked at a nearby detention center. He adopted her children, creating a sense of structure that had been missing before. Samantha herself didn't maintain steady employment, instead focusing on raising her children, spending much of her time at home. To those around her, she appeared devoted, present, engaged in the daily responsibilities of motherhood. While Samantha settled into this version of family life, Robbie was charting his own path. He was younger, still in the process of building his future. He attended Clemson University, studying architecture, a field that suggested both creativity and ambition. There was a sense that he was moving towards something promising, that his life was opening into possibilities that extended beyond the boundaries of Horry County. Despite his studies, he remained connected to his family. He maintained a close relationship with his father and stayed in contact with Samantha, their bond continuing into adulthood. Then, in 2016, the family faced a loss that altered their dynamic once again. Melda, Robert's wife and Robbie's mother, died suddenly. The impact was immediate and profound. For Robert, it meant losing a partner, someone who had shared his life and helped shape his home. For Robbie, it meant losing a parent at a stage in life where he was still finding his footing. Grief settled into the household, changing the rhythm of daily life in ways that weren't always visible, but were deeply felt. In the aftermath, Robert and Robbie leaned on each other. Their relationship, already close, became even more central. They lived together, sharing not just a home, but the process of navigating loss. Samantha remained part of that support system, staying connected, visiting, maintaining the sense of family that had always defined them. By the summer of 2018, the Ford family, despite its challenges, appeared stable once more. Robert continued his routines, his involvement in the community, his role as a father and grandfather. Robbie was preparing for the next step in his education, planning to spend a semester in Charleston. There was movement forward, a sense that life, though marked by hardship, was continuing. And yet, beneath that surface, something unseen was already taking shape. The quiet roads, the open fields, the familiar routines, all of it created an environment where danger didn't announce itself. It blended in, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The Ford family, like so many others in Horry County, believed in the predictability of their world. They believed that the people around them were known, that threats came from outside, not from within the circles of trust they had built over years. That belief would soon be tested in the most devastating way possible, shattering not just a family, but the very sense of safety that defined the community they called home. If you had met Samantha as a child, nothing about her would have suggested the kind of story her name would one day be tied to. She grew up in a world that revolved around routine and familiarity, a life shaped by Sunday mornings in pressed clothes, the scent of polished wooden pews, and the steady cadence of hymns that filled the church her father loved so deeply. People watched her grow up there, not as a stranger passing through, but as someone who belonged, someone whose life unfolded in front of a community that believed it knew her. She wasn't loud or disruptive, not the kind of child who demanded attention. Instead, she blended into the background in a way that felt safe, predictable, easy to understand. Her relationship with her father was the kind that built slowly over time, reinforced through consistency rather than grand gestures. Even after her parents separated, Robert remained a constant presence. The distance created by two households never fully severed their connection. Weekends, visits, shared meals, these moments stitched together a bond that endured despite the fracture of divorce. To Samantha, her father was steady, someone who didn't shift unpredictably, someone who showed up in the ways that mattered. To Robert, she was more than just his first child. She was a reminder of the life he had built before things had changed, a part of him that existed outside of the complications that came later. When Robbie was born, the dynamic shifted in subtle ways. Samantha was no longer the only child orbiting her father's attention. There was now a younger presence, louder, more demanding in the way small children often are. But the transition didn't fracture the bond between siblings. If anything, it added a new layer to it. Robbie followed her, mimicked her, sought her approval in the small, unconscious ways younger siblings do. And while there were moments of irritation, fleeting and harmless, Samantha never pushed him away. She accepted him as part of her world, not as a rival, but as someone who belonged alongside her. As she grew older, Samantha's life began to diverge from the expectations that had quietly been set for her. The structure of church and community came with unspoken rules, guidelines that shaped how people believed life should unfold. Marriage before children. Stability before independence. a path that moved forward in careful, predictable steps. But life rarely follows a script, and for Samantha, that deviation came in the form of a pregnancy that arrived before everything else was in place. At 21, she found herself standing at a crossroads that carried more weight than most people her age were prepared for. The news didn't just belong to her. It rippled outward, touching her family, her father's standing in the church, the way people looked at them when they walked into a room. There were whispers, judgments that weren't always spoken aloud but were felt in the spaces between conversations, in the way glances lingered just a moment too long. It was the kind of pressure that could isolate someone, make them feel as though they had stepped outside the boundaries of acceptance. But Samantha didn't face it alone. Robert's reaction, while not without disappointment, didn't turn into rejection. He didn't withdraw from her or treat her as a mistake to be hidden. Instead, he adjusted, absorbing the impact in a way that shifted his own place within the community. Stepping down from his role in the church wasn't just a formality. It was a public acknowledgement of the situation, a consequence he accepted without pushing it onto his daughter. In that decision, something between them strengthened. It wasn't built on perfection, but on loyalty. When her daughter was born, Samantha stepped into a new identity almost overnight. Motherhood reshaped her life, narrowing her focus onto something immediate and demanding. The long-term plans that might have once existed gave way to the daily realities of caring for a child. Sleepless nights, constant attention, the quiet moments of exhaustion that settled in when the world around her seemed to keep moving forward while she stood still, anchored by responsibility. But there was also a sense of purpose, something tangible that grounded her in a way that nothing else had before. Robert embraced this new chapter alongside her. As a grandfather, he found a kind of joy that softened the edges of everything that had come before. He held the child, spent time with her, invested himself in her life in a way that felt natural. The tension that had once existed faded into the background, replaced by something warmer, more forgiving. For Samantha, this meant she didn't lose her father's support. If anything, she gained more of it. Over the next few years, her life continued to evolve in ways that weren't always smooth. She had more children, twin boys, adding to the complexity of her world. Relationships came and went, stability sometimes feeling just out of reach. There were moments where the path forward seemed uncertain, where the responsibilities of raising 3 young children weighed heavily against the lack of a consistent foundation. But eventually, she found something that resembled balance. She met a man who brought structure into her life, someone who stepped into the role of a father for her children, adopting them and creating a sense of permanence that had been missing. From the outside, it looked like things had settled. Samantha spent most of her time at home, focused on her children, her days shaped by routines that revolved around their needs. School schedules, meals, small moments of normalcy that, to others, suggested stability. She wasn't building a career in the traditional sense, but in the context of her life, that wasn't unusual. In a place like Horry County, there were many paths, and not all of them followed the same structure. Her relationship with her father remained close throughout this period. She visited often, helped around the house, brought meals. These were the kinds of gestures that reinforced the image of a daughter who cared, who stayed connected despite having her own life to manage. Conversations between them continued, sometimes about small things, sometimes about larger concerns, but always with a sense of familiarity that came from years of shared history. And then there was Robbie. By the time Samantha had settled into her role as a mother, Robbie was stepping into adulthood. His life moved in a different direction, shaped by education and opportunity. Attending Clemson University, studying architecture, he carried with him a sense of potential that extended beyond the boundaries of the rural world he came from. There was an expectation, both spoken and unspoken, that he would go further, achieve more, build something that reflected the effort his father had put into raising him. Despite the differences in their lives, the connection between Samantha and Robbie didn't disappear. They spoke regularly, maintained a relationship that, while shaped by distance and differing responsibilities, still held onto the familiarity of shared childhood experiences. Robbie visited when he could, spent time with his niece and nephews, moving easily between his world and the one he had grown up in. After their mother's death in 2016, that connection became even more significant. Grief has a way of pulling people together, of creating a need for support that overrides smaller differences. Samantha, Robbie, and Robert formed a kind of support system, each playing a role in helping the others navigate the loss. It wasn't always expressed in words. Sometimes it showed up in presence, in the simple act of being there. To those watching from the outside, the Ford family represented something familiar, a group that had faced challenges, but remained intact. There were no obvious fractures, no visible signs of conflict that would suggest anything deeper was wrong. Samantha was seen as a devoted mother, a daughter who maintained her relationship with her father, a sister who stayed in touch with her brother. Robbie was viewed as promising, respectful, someone moving toward a future that held opportunity. Robert remained the steady center, the figure that connected them all. But families are rarely as simple as they appear from the outside. Beneath the surface, dynamics shift in ways that aren't always visible. Expectations, comparisons, unspoken tensions, these things don't always manifest in obvious conflict. Sometimes they exist quietly, building over time, shaping perceptions in ways that even those involved may not fully recognize. In a world where appearances often define reality, Samantha fit the image of someone who had overcome early challenges and built a stable life. She had children, a home, a husband. She maintained ties to her family, participated in the rhythms of the community. There was nothing outwardly alarming, nothing that suggested a capacity for something darker. And yet, as with so many stories that unfold into tragedy, the truth didn't lie in what was visible. It lay in the spaces people didn't see, in the thoughts that weren't spoken, in the quiet calculations that, once set in motion, would lead to a moment where everything that defined her, daughter, sister, mother, would collide with a decision that would change all of it forever. The evening of August 17, 2018, settled over Horry County with the same quiet familiarity it always carried, the heat of the day slowly easing as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the gravel roads and open fields. There was nothing in the air that hinted at what was about to unfold, no sudden shift, no warning that the rhythm of an ordinary night was about to be broken. For Robert and Robbie Ford, the evening had followed a simple plan. They had spent the day in Charleston, a trip that carried a sense of forward movement, of planning for the future. Robbie was preparing for the next chapter of his education, looking at apartments, imagining what life might look like beyond the boundaries of the home he had always known. It was the kind of trip that fathers and sons take without thinking much of it, practical, focused, yet quietly meaningful. As the day wound down, they began the drive back home, the miles passing beneath them in a steady rhythm. The road stretched out ahead, familiar and unremarkable, the kind of route they had likely taken countless times before. There may have been conversation, or perhaps long stretches of comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who don't need to fill every moment with words. By the time they neared Horry County, night had settled in, the darkness thick in the rural areas where streetlights were few and far between. Somewhere along the way, they picked up food, the small detail that would later become part of a much larger picture. To-go cups, a bag with leftovers, evidence of an ordinary stop in an otherwise uneventful evening. It was the kind of thing no one thinks twice about, the kind of detail that fades almost immediately from memory. They were coming home. That was all that mattered. What they didn't know was that someone else had been waiting. The property sat in near total darkness, the house silhouetted against the night, the surrounding land stretching out into shadows that concealed more than they revealed. In the woods nearby, hidden just beyond the edge of visibility, a figure waited. Time moved differently in that space, stretched thin by anticipation. Minutes turned into hours, each sound carrying weight, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of insects, the occasional passing vehicle far off on another road. The waiting wasn't random. It was deliberate, planned, sustained by the certainty that eventually headlights would appear. And then they did. The sound of tires crunching over gravel broke the stillness, announcing the arrival of the vehicle before it came fully into view. The headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the yard before settling as the car came to a stop. For Robert and Robbie, it was the end of a long day, the familiar act of returning home. There was no reason to hesitate, no reason to suspect that anything was out of place. The house was as they had left it. The yard was quiet. Everything appeared normal. Robbie pulled into the driveway, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. The night wrapped around them, thick and unbroken. Robert stepped out first, moving toward the back steps of the house, likely with the simple intention of going inside, setting down the food, ending the day. It was in that moment, in that ordinary movement, that everything changed. The first shot came without warning. It was close, immediate, leaving no time for reaction. The sound shattered the quiet, echoing across the open land before fading into the night. Robert's body absorbed the impact at point-blank range, the force of it stopping him before he could even register what was happening. There was no struggle, no chance to turn or defend himself. The precision of the shot spoke of proximity, of someone who had stepped out of the darkness at exactly the right moment. Robbie heard it. The sound, the sudden collapse of normalcy, triggered something instinctive. There was no time to process, only to react. He moved, turning away from the direction of the shot, his body shifting into motion in an attempt to escape something he couldn't yet fully understand. Fear doesn't always come with clarity. Sometimes it comes as a surge, a command to run before the mind catches up. The second shot followed. It struck him in the upper right shoulder, the impact breaking his movement, pulling him down. The ground met him hard, the momentum cut short. Pain, confusion, the disorienting realization that whatever was happening was not going to stop. He was no longer moving away. He was on the ground, vulnerable, exposed. The figure closed the distance. There was no hesitation, no sign of doubt. The final shot was delivered from behind, at close range, precise and final. It ended any possibility of escape, any chance of survival. In a matter of seconds, 2 lives had been extinguished, the violence contained within a space that only moments before had been defined by routine. The silence that followed was different from the one that had come before. It wasn't the quiet of a rural night, natural and expected. It was heavier, marked by what had just occurred. The bodies lay where they had fallen, the evidence of the attack already beginning to settle into stillness. Blood darkened against the ground, its color deepening as time passed, the air carrying the faint metallic scent that accompanies it. But the act wasn't over. The person responsible didn't leave immediately. There were movements deliberate and purposeful. Wallets were taken, small items removed in a way that suggested intention beyond the act of killing. Keys were collected. The scene was being shaped, adjusted, altered to create a narrative that would later be questioned. It wasn't enough to end their lives. There was an effort to control how those deaths would be perceived. The vehicle, Robbie's vehicle, became part of that plan. It was driven away from the house, leaving behind the place where the violence had occurred, carrying with it whatever traces might connect the scene to the person who had been there. The road leading away from the property stretched into darkness, the movement of the car unobserved, unnoticed. In a place where distance separated neighbors and activity was sparse, it was possible to move without being seen. The soybean field was chosen for a reason. Isolated, removed from the main roads, it offered a space where the next step could be carried out without interruption. The car was positioned among the rows, out of place, yet hidden in the vastness of the land. The intention was clear: destroy it. Fuel was used, the sharp scent of gasoline cutting through the night air as it was applied. The fire was set, flames catching and beginning to consume what they could reach. For a moment, it must have seemed like it would work, that the evidence would be erased, reduced to ash and unrecognizable fragments. But fire is unpredictable, dependent on conditions that weren't fully accounted for. The windows remained closed, the oxygen limited. The flames struggled, flickered, and then began to die out before they could complete their task. The result was incomplete. The car was damaged, blackened, but not destroyed. Inside, items remained. Outside, small pieces of evidence were left behind, unnoticed in the moment, but critical in what would come later. The person responsible didn't stay to ensure the job was finished. There was a point where leaving became more important than perfection, where the risk of being discovered outweighed the need to eliminate every trace. A call was made, a pickup arranged. The night continued, carrying away the person who had just committed an act that would soon ripple outward, touching lives far beyond that isolated field and quiet home. By the time the darkness gave way to morning, the scene at the Ford property remained undisturbed, the bodies undiscovered, the truth hidden behind a carefully constructed illusion. But illusions rarely hold. What had been done with precision would begin to unravel, not all at once, but in fragments. A burned car in a field, 2 bodies outside a home. Small details that didn't align. The story that had been staged would begin to show cracks, and through those cracks, something far more unsettling would emerge. Because this wasn't just an act of violence committed in the shadows of a rural night. It was the execution of a plan, one that had been set in motion long before Robert and Robbie Ford ever turned into their driveway that evening, unaware that the place they called home had already become the setting for their final moments. By the time the first wave of investigators settled into the scene, the initial shock had given way to a more methodical kind of focus, the kind that comes from years of training, from seeing enough violence to know that emotion has to step aside, at least for now. The property was sealed off, the boundaries marked not just by tape, but by an unspoken understanding that everything within that space mattered. Every footprint, every object, every absence of something that should have been there, these were the pieces that would eventually shape the truth if they were handled correctly. The bodies remained where they had fallen, preserved in place as technicians moved carefully around them. Robert lay closest to the house, his position fixed near the back steps, as though he had been only a step or 2 away from safety when his life was taken. The wound beneath his chin told its own story, one that didn't require speculation. It was a contact shot, the kind delivered at point-blank range, intimate in a way that made it impossible to ignore the proximity between victim and attacker. There was no defensive posture, no sign of a struggle, no indication that he had been aware of the danger in time to react. Whatever had happened, it had happened quickly, decisively. Further out on the grass, Robbie's body marked the second part of that sequence. The angle, the placement, the wounds, they all pointed toward movement. He had tried to get away. The shot to his shoulder suggested he had been turning or running when he was hit, the trajectory aligning with someone attempting to escape rather than confront. The final wound, delivered to the back of his head, removed any ambiguity. It was execution, not chaos. The spacing between the 2 bodies created a silent narrative, one that investigators could follow without a single word being spoken. Time of death became an early consideration. The condition of the bodies, the coagulation of blood, the temperature, all of it pointed toward a window several hours before discovery, likely somewhere between 6 and 12 hours earlier. That placed the murders firmly in the previous evening, aligning with the faint recollections of neighbors who had heard something but hadn't recognized it for what it was. As the forensic team continued their work, attention shifted to the immediate surroundings. The takeout containers and cups near the bodies were documented, photographed, collected. They reinforced the idea that Robert and Robbie had just returned home, that they had been in the middle of an ordinary moment when everything changed. There was no sign they had been expecting anyone, no indication that they had invited someone onto the property. The lack of disturbance suggested that whoever had been there had either approached them suddenly or had been in a position where their presence didn't immediately raise alarm. The house itself offered another layer of insight, not through what it revealed, but through what it didn't. The doors were still locked when law enforcement arrived, forcing them to enter through standard procedure rather than any obvious point of forced access. Windows were intact. There were no signs of prying, no splintered frames, no evidence of someone breaking in. Inside, everything appeared undisturbed. Furniture remained in place, personal belongings untouched, the quiet order of a lived-in home frozen exactly as it had been left. For investigators, this absence of disruption was as telling as any physical evidence. If this had been a robbery, it was an unusual one. There was no ransacking, no hurried search for valuables, no signs that anyone had entered the home to take anything of significance. Yet the wallets were missing. That detail stood out, not because of what it suggested, but because of how little sense it made in the broader context. Taking wallets without attempting to access the house, without searching for other items, felt incomplete. It was a gesture, not a genuine objective. That idea began to take shape more clearly as detectives stepped back and looked at the scene as a whole. The positioning of the bodies, the lack of forced entry, the selective removal of items, it all pointed towards something deliberate. This wasn't a robbery that had gone wrong. It was something staged to look like one. The realization shifted the direction of the investigation almost immediately. Instead of asking what had been taken, detectives began asking who would want to create that impression, and more importantly, why. Staging a crime scene requires forethought. It requires an understanding of how investigators think, what they look for, how they interpret evidence. It suggested that whoever had done this wasn't acting purely on impulse. There had been planning involved, decisions made in advance about how the aftermath would appear. Outside the immediate perimeter of the house, the canvassing process began. In a rural area like this, neighbors were spread out, their homes separated by fields and stretches of land that created both privacy and isolation. The nearest neighbor lived far enough away that any direct observation of the Ford property would have been unlikely. But sound travels differently in open spaces, especially at night. One neighbor recalled being outside the previous evening, sometime around 8:45 p.m. The memory wasn't precise, but it was enough to establish a timeline. He had heard what he believed to be a gunshot, followed by a scream, and then another gunshot. At the time, it hadn't seemed unusual. Gunfire was common enough in the area, part of the background noise of rural life. Hunting, target practice, these were ordinary activities that didn't raise alarm. It was only in hindsight, with the knowledge of what had happened, that those sounds took on a different meaning. That account aligned with the estimated time of death, reinforcing the idea that the murders had occurred shortly after Robert and Robbie returned home. It also added a layer of confirmation to the sequence investigators had begun to piece together. First shot, likely Robert. A reaction, possibly a scream. Second shot, Robbie being hit. The timeline was tightening, becoming more defined. Meanwhile, the burned vehicle in the soybean field became a focal point of its own. Detectives recognized its significance immediately. It wasn't just an abandoned car, it was an extension of the crime scene, a secondary location where someone had attempted to eliminate evidence. The decision to move the vehicle suggested an awareness of its potential value to investigators, an effort to separate it from the primary scene and destroy whatever it might contain. When investigators arrived at the field, the scene told a story of its own. The vehicle's exterior was scorched, its interior coated in soot, but it was far from completely destroyed. The fire had failed to do what it was intended to do. The lack of oxygen inside the sealed vehicle had suffocated the flames before they could fully consume the contents. For detectives, this failure was critical. It meant that whatever had been left behind was still there, waiting to be found. The smell of gasoline was still strong, clinging to the interior and the surrounding air. It confirmed that an accelerant had been used, that the fire had been deliberately set. Inside the vehicle, items were documented and collected, each one potentially holding a clue. But it was outside the car that one of the most significant discoveries was made. Near the driver's side door, on the ground, lay 3 cigarette butts, smoked down almost to the filter. At first glance, they might have seemed insignificant, easily overlooked in a less thorough search. But, to experienced investigators, they represented something invaluable. Cigarette filters retain saliva, and with it, DNA. Unlike fingerprints, which can be wiped away or smudged, DNA embedded in a cigarette filter is far more resilient. The presence of multiple cigarette butts suggested time. Someone had been there long enough to smoke more than one cigarette, possibly waiting, possibly thinking, possibly unaware of the evidence they were leaving behind. It painted a picture of a person who wasn't in a rush at that moment, someone who believed they were in control of the situation. Inside the vehicle, another item stood out, a wool ski cap. It was out of place, not something that would naturally belong on the floor of a car in the middle of August in South Carolina. Its presence suggested preparation, an attempt to conceal identity, to avoid being recognized. But like the cigarette butts, It had survived the failed fire, preserved in a way that would soon become significant. Each of these elements, the cigarette butts, the ski cap, the partially burned vehicle, added to the growing sense that the person responsible had made mistakes. Not obvious ones, not the kind that would immediately reveal their identity, but small oversights that, when combined, created a trail. Back at the primary scene, detectives began to widen their focus beyond the physical evidence. They started asking questions about the victims themselves.
Who were they?
What were their routines? Did they have enemies? Had there been any recent conflicts or unusual events? Robert Ford was known as a quiet, law-abiding man, deeply involved in his church and community. Robbie was seen as a young man with a promising future, focused on his education and maintaining strong ties to his family. There was nothing in their immediate backgrounds that suggested they would be targets of violence, especially not something this calculated. That absence of an obvious motive only deepened the mystery. Random violence seemed unlikely. A robbery didn't fit the evidence. What remained was the possibility that the answer lay not in what had happened that night, but in something that had been building long before it. As the sun moved higher in the sky and the hours passed, the investigation settled into its early phase, defined by careful documentation and the slow accumulation of details. Each piece of evidence was cataloged, each observation recorded, each question leading to another. There were no immediate answers, no clear suspect, no simple explanation that tied everything together. But there was a pattern emerging, faint at first, then gradually more defined. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was not the result of chance or sudden impulse. It was targeted, deliberate, and constructed in a way that suggested the victims had been chosen, not randomly, but for a reason that had yet to be uncovered. And somewhere within that growing collection of evidence, within the cigarette butts, the ski cap, the missing wallets, and the quiet details of a home left untouched, lay the beginning of a path that would lead investigators closer to the truth, one step at a time, one discovery building on the last, until the illusion of a simple crime would give way to something far more unsettling. In the days that followed, the investigation began to stretch outward from the crime scenes, moving beyond the physical evidence and into the lives that surrounded Robert and Robbie Ford. What had initially been a contained scene, a home, a field, a burned vehicle, expanded into a web of relationships, routines, and quiet histories that investigators needed to understand if they were going to find a motive. Because without motive, the precision of the killings made even less sense. Someone had waited, executed, staged, and attempted to destroy evidence. That kind of effort didn't come without reason. Detectives started where they always did, with the people closest to the victims. Family, friends, co-workers, anyone who might offer insight into whether something had been building beneath the surface. Samantha was among the first to be contacted again after her initial presence at the scene. Her reaction had been consistent with what investigators expected: shock, confusion, visible grief. There had been no immediate red flags in her demeanor, nothing that stood out as unnatural in those first moments. But procedure required more than impressions. It required verification. When questioned more formally, Samantha described the last time she had spoken with her father and brother. They had been in Charleston, she said, looking for an apartment for Robbie's upcoming semester. She knew they were returning that night. Their communication had been normal, nothing out of place, nothing that suggested tension or concern. Her account aligned with what investigators had already begun to piece together from the scene. There was no contradiction, no immediate inconsistency. Her alibi, when examined, appeared solid. Surveillance footage placed her at a convenience store during the estimated time of the murders. Phone records supported that timeline, showing no activity connecting her device to the area near her father's home. For investigators, that mattered. It didn't eliminate her entirely. Very few people are ever fully eliminated in the early stages, but it reduced the likelihood of direct involvement at the scene, at least physically. Attention then shifted to Robert and Robbie's broader circle. Interviews with neighbors, acquaintances, and members of the church community painted a consistent picture. Robert was respected, seen as dependable and kind. He didn't have known enemies, no ongoing disputes that would escalate to violence. Robbie, younger and focused on his education, carried a similar reputation. There were no obvious conflicts, no recent arguments, no signs that either man had been involved in something that would make them targets. That absence of conflict created a different kind of pressure on the investigation. When victims appear to have no enemies, the question becomes more complicated. It forces investigators to look beyond the obvious, to consider possibilities that don't present themselves easily. Financial motives, hidden relationships, long-standing grievances, these are the kinds of factors that don't always surface in casual conversation. The prior burglary at the Ford home in 2017 became one of the first threads to revisit. At the time, it had been treated as a standalone incident. Items had been taken, a .38 revolver, jewelry, a laptop, but nothing about it had suggested it would connect to something more serious. Now, with 2 murders at the same property, investigators had to consider whether that earlier crime had been random or part of a larger pattern. On its surface, the burglary didn't fit neatly into the current case. Returning a year later to commit a double homicide without taking anything else from the house didn't align with typical criminal behavior. Burglars seek opportunity, not prolonged involvement with the same target, especially not escalation to murder, without clear gain. Still, it couldn't be dismissed entirely. The stolen firearm, in particular, raised questions. If it had remained unaccounted for, it was possible it had re-entered the picture in a way no one had anticipated. As these lines of inquiry continued, the forensic side of the investigation moved forward at its own pace. The cigarette butts and the ski cap recovered from the soybean field were processed, their potential significance clear from the moment they were collected. DNA extraction began, the lab working through the samples with the expectation that they would produce a usable profile. When the results came back, they offered both progress and frustration. The DNA profile was clean, single source, indicating it belonged to one individual. That alone was a major development. Mixed samples can complicate analysis, introduce uncertainty. A single-source profile is clarity, a direct link to one person. Investigators recognized its value immediately. There was an expectation, almost an assumption, that the profile would match someone already in the system. CODIS, the National DNA Database, contains profiles from convicted offenders, individuals arrested for certain crimes, and evidence from other cases. Given the nature of the crime, the planning involved, it seemed reasonable to believe the person responsible might have a prior record. The sample was entered into the system. And then nothing. No match. No hit. The profile existed, but it didn't correspond to anyone currently in the database. For investigators, this was a setback but not an endpoint. It meant the suspect either had no qualifying criminal history or had managed to avoid having their DNA recorded. It didn't erase the evidence, it simply delayed its usefulness. With no immediate match, the investigation continued along multiple paths. Detectives revisited timelines, cross-referenced phone records, looked for any unusual activity in the days leading up to the murders. They examined financial records, searching for irregularities that might point to motive, debts, disputes, sudden changes in behavior. It was during this phase that subtle observations began to take on more weight. Samantha's actions in the weeks following the murders drew attention, not because they were overtly suspicious on their own, but because of their timing and context. She moved into her father's home, the same property where the murders had occurred. She began the process of accessing his assets, including insurance policies. Individually, these actions could be explained. Losing a parent often involves managing estates, handling financial matters, making decisions about property. But the speed at which these steps were taken raised questions. It suggested a level of readiness, a familiarity with what needed to be done that felt immediate. Investigators learned that Robert had significant assets, life insurance policies, land, financial holdings. Initially, Robbie had been the primary beneficiary of much of it. With both father and son gone, that structure changed. Samantha became the sole beneficiary. The implication was clear. There was financial gain tied directly to the deaths. Still, motive alone isn't evidence of guilt. Investigators needed more than a reason. They needed a connection, something tangible that linked a person to the act itself. As weeks turned into months, the case entered a phase that many investigations reach, a period where progress slows, where leads are followed and gradually exhausted, where the initial urgency gives way to persistence. The evidence remained, but without a direct link to a suspect, it existed in isolation. That's when the idea of expanding the DNA search beyond traditional databases began to take shape. Forensic genealogy had become an emerging tool in law enforcement, offering a way to identify suspects through familial connections rather than direct matches. By comparing DNA profiles to those submitted voluntarily to commercial ancestry services, investigators could identify potential relatives of the unknown individual, then work backward to narrow down possible identities. It wasn't a quick process. It required time, resources, and careful analysis. But in cases where traditional methods stalled, it offered a new path. The decision was made to pursue it. While that process unfolded, detectives continued to revisit the case from different angles, refusing to let it settle into stagnation. They re-examined interviews, looking for inconsistencies that might have been overlooked. They considered the possibility that the person responsible had a connection to the victims that hadn't yet been fully understood. The idea that this was a targeted attack remained central. Someone had chosen that location, that time, those individuals. It wasn't random. It wasn't opportunistic. It was intentional. And intention, in cases like this, often points inward. The longer the investigation continued, the more that possibility began to take shape, not as a conclusion, but as a direction. The answers, when they came, were likely to be found not in distant connections or unknown enemies, but within the circle of people who knew Robert and Robbie best. It was an unsettling thought, one that investigators couldn't ignore, even as they worked to prove or disprove it through evidence rather than assumption. Because if that direction proved true, it would mean that the violence that had shattered the Ford family didn't come from outside their world. It came from within it. For nearly 2 years, the case existed in a kind of suspended tension, never abandoned but never fully breaking open either. Detectives carried it with them, revisiting it in quiet moments, turning over the same details again and again, waiting for something, anything, to shift. The evidence hadn't disappeared. The cigarette butts, the DNA profile, the timeline, the inconsistencies, they were all still there, preserved, waiting for the moment they would finally connect to something real. But time has a way of dulling urgency, not in the minds of investigators, but in the world around them. Leads grow colder. Memories fade. People move on. And yet, beneath the surface, the case was still moving, slowly, methodically, in a direction that no one outside the investigation could yet see. The breakthrough didn't come in a dramatic flash. It came quietly, through the kind of work that rarely makes headlines, data analysis, patience, and the willingness to follow a lead that might not pay off. The DNA profile that had once sat in Cody's without a match was sent through a different channel, one that operated outside the traditional boundaries of law enforcement databases. Forensic genealogy began to do what it was designed to do: look not for the person directly, but for the people connected to them. The process was painstaking. It involved comparing genetic markers, identifying potential relatives, building family trees that stretched outward and then narrowed back in. It wasn't about certainty at first. It was about probability, about finding a cluster of individuals who might share enough DNA with the unknown profile to suggest a connection. From there, investigators could begin to work backward, eliminating possibilities, focusing on those who fit the profile not just genetically, but circumstantially. When the results finally came back, they didn't provide a name immediately. Instead, they pointed toward a family, 2 individuals whose DNA partially matched the unknown profile. They were brothers, both incarcerated, their genetic material already on record. That detail mattered, because it meant the connection wasn't random. The unknown individual was related to them, likely a sibling. That realization narrowed the field dramatically. Investigators now had a direction, a family line to follow. From there, it didn't take long to identify a potential suspect: Randy Granger. Randy wasn't an unknown figure in the criminal justice system. His history stretched back years, marked by prior convictions and time spent in prison. He wasn't someone who blended quietly into the background. But what made him significant wasn't just his past, it was his proximity to the evidence. Cell tower data placed him near the soybean field on the night of the murders. His presence in that area at that time wasn't something that could be easily explained away. For investigators, this was the first real foothold they had in the case. A name. A person. Someone who could be questioned, confronted, examined in the context of everything they had already uncovered. But as they dug deeper, another connection began to emerge, one that shifted the entire direction of the investigation. Phone records revealed that Randy had made a call on the night of the murders. The number he contacted didn't belong to a random acquaintance or a distant contact. It belonged to a woman named Teresa Martin. At first glance, Teresa might not have seemed significant. But as investigators looked into her background, the connection became clear. She was related, distantly but undeniably, to Samantha, a cousin on her mother's side. The pieces began to align in a way that was both compelling and unsettling. The DNA at the scene pointed to Randy. Randy had contacted Teresa. Teresa was connected to Samantha. The question was no longer just who had committed the murders. It was whether those connections meant something more. Bringing Randy and Teresa in for questioning was a critical step, but it was also a delicate one. By this point, investigators had enough to suspect involvement, but not enough to fully prove it. The goal wasn't just to confirm what they already believed. It was to get them to talk. They were placed in separate rooms, isolated from each other, each facing a different set of pressures. Randy, when confronted with the evidence, remained largely silent. He didn't offer explanations, didn't attempt to construct a narrative that could distance him from the scene. His silence was its own kind of resistance, a refusal to engage that forced investigators to shift their focus. Teresa, however, responded differently. At first, she was cautious, deflecting questions, offering minimal information. But interviews like this are rarely about immediate confessions. They're about gradual movement, about creating an environment where the truth becomes easier to tell than maintaining the lie. Investigators approached her carefully, not with accusations, but with opportunities. They emphasized the difference between knowing something and being responsible for it, the idea that cooperation could change how she was viewed. It worked, but not all at once. Teresa began what investigators refer to as progressive truth-telling. Small admissions at first, details that seemed insignificant on their own, but built toward something larger. She acknowledged that Randy had called her on the night of the murders, that she had picked him up. That alone placed her closer to the event than she had initially admitted. But she didn't stop there. As the conversation continued, the details became more specific, more direct. She described a conversation that had taken place about a week before the murders. A discussion between Randy and Samantha. A plan. According to Teresa, Samantha had approached Randy with a proposition. It wasn't vague. It wasn't implied. It was explicit. She wanted her father dead. And not just her father, her brother as well. The reason, as Teresa described it, was rooted in something investigators had already considered but hadn't been able to prove. Money. Inheritance. Control over assets that, under normal circumstances, would have been divided. The plan, as it was laid out, was calculated. Both Robert and Robbie had to die. If only one of them was killed, the distribution of assets wouldn't shift in the way Samantha needed it to. It was an all-or-nothing scenario, one that required precision. Teresa described how Samantha had offered Randy $20,000 to carry out the murders. A sum significant enough to motivate, but not so large as to draw immediate attention. She also described how the plan was executed. Randy would be dropped off near the property. He would wait. He would strike when Robert and Robbie returned home. There was even a code embedded in their communication. A text message sent on the day of the murders. "I'm home alone." On its surface, it meant nothing. But in context, it signaled that the conditions were set, that the plan could move forward. For investigators, this was the moment everything shifted. What had once been a case built on physical evidence and circumstantial connections now had a narrative, one that linked all the pieces together. The DNA, the cell tower data, the phone records, the financial motive, they all pointed in the same direction.
Samantha.
But even with Teresa's statement, the case wasn't complete. Statements can be challenged. Testimony can be questioned. Investigators needed more corroboration, evidence that could support what Teresa was saying. That came from multiple directions. Randy's presence at the scene was confirmed through DNA. His connection to Teresa was established through phone records. Teresa's connection to Samantha was documented through family ties and communication history. The financial motive was supported by insurance policies and asset distribution. Piece by piece, the case solidified. When the decision was made to arrest Samantha, it wasn't based on a single piece of evidence. It was the result of everything coming together at once. The plan, the execution, the aftermath, it all pointed back to her. She was taken into custody at her mother's residence, the timing deliberate, marking 2 years since the murders had occurred. For investigators, it wasn't just about making the arrest. It was about closing a circle that had remained open for far too long. The reaction from the community was immediate and intense. Shock, disbelief, confusion. The idea that someone like Samantha, someone who had grown up in their midst, who had been part of the same church, the same routines, could be connected to something like this, it didn't align with the image they had of her. Even as the evidence mounted, there were those who struggled to accept it, who questioned how someone could orchestrate something so calculated, so detached from the relationships that had defined her life. But the investigation had moved beyond speculation. It had uncovered a truth that was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. A truth that revealed not just who had committed the crime, but why, and how that why had been building long before the first shot was fired on that quiet August night. The courtroom felt smaller than it should have, as if the weight of everything that had happened pressed inward from the walls, narrowing the space between the people who had come to witness the end of a story that had begun years earlier in blood and silence. By the time the trial began in February of 2024, nearly 6 years had passed since Robert and Robbie Ford were found outside their home, and yet the memory of that day had not softened. It had settled into the community, into the family, into the lives of everyone connected to it, waiting for this moment when it would be examined in full view, piece by piece, under the harsh clarity of a courtroom. Samantha sat at the defense table, composed in a way that could be interpreted in different ways depending on who was looking at her. To some, she appeared calm, steady, someone holding on to her version of events with quiet determination. To others, that same stillness felt distant, detached, as though she had already separated herself from what was unfolding around her. Behind her, supporters filled the benches, her husband among them, along with family members who had chosen to stand by her despite everything that had come to light. Across the room, the other side was just as full, but the energy there carried a different tone. Friends of Robert, members of the church, extended family, they sat close together, their presence a reflection of the lives that had been lost and the absence that remained. The prosecution began by laying out the structure of the case in a way that was both methodical and deliberate. They didn't rush. They couldn't. This wasn't a case built on a single piece of evidence or a spontaneous confession. It was constructed from layers: physical evidence, digital records, witness testimony, financial motives, all of it needing to align in a way that left no reasonable doubt. They walked the jury back to the beginning, to the soybean field, to the burned vehicle, to the cigarette butts that had quietly preserved the identity of the man who had carried out the killings. Randy Granger became the central figure in that narrative, not because he was the one on trial in that moment, but because he was the one who had pulled the trigger. By the time Samantha's trial began, Randy had already been convicted, sentenced to life in prison for the murders. His fate had been decided, but his role in the story was far from over. Now he was a witness, a man whose credibility would be questioned from the moment he took the stand, but whose testimony had the potential to connect every piece of the case directly to Samantha. When he entered the courtroom, there was a shift, subtle but undeniable. He wasn't polished or composed. His presence carried the weight of his past, the years he had spent in and out of prison, the reality of what he had done. When he spoke, his voice didn't carry emotion in the way people might expect. It was direct, almost flat at times, as though he had repeated this story enough that the details had settled into something routine. He described how he came to know Samantha, how the conversation had started, how the plan had been presented to him. There was no attempt to soften it, no effort to frame it as something less than what it was. She had asked him to kill her father and her brother. She had offered him $20,000 to do it. The words hung in the air, heavy and unfiltered, forcing everyone in the room to confront the reality of what was being described. He talked about the logistics, the way the plan had been laid out, the need for both men to die, the understanding that leaving one alive would change the outcome Samantha was seeking. He described being given the gun, waiting in the woods for hours, smoking cigarettes to pass the time, watching the house in the distance until the moment finally came. The details matched the evidence in ways that were difficult to ignore. The cigarette butts found near the burned vehicle, the timeline established by the neighbor who had heard the gunshots, the positioning of the bodies. When he recounted the actual killings, the room seemed to hold its breath. There was no dramatization in his voice, no attempt to make it more or less than it was. He described Robert stepping out of the car, the shot fired at close range, the immediate collapse. He described Robbie's reaction, the attempt to run, the shot that brought him down, the final shot that ended it. Each detail aligned with what investigators had already determined from the scene, reinforcing the idea that this wasn't a fabricated story designed to shift blame. It was a recounting of events that had already been partially reconstructed through evidence. But the defense was ready for that. They didn't dispute that Randy had committed the murders. That part of the case was already established. Instead, they focused on the connection between Randy and Samantha, challenging the idea that his testimony could be trusted. They pointed out the obvious. Randy was a convicted murderer, a man who had every incentive to cooperate with the prosecution in hopes of receiving some form of leniency. They questioned his motives, suggested that he had shaped his story to fit what investigators wanted to hear. They pressed him on inconsistencies, on details that could be interpreted in different ways. They asked why, if this had been a planned murder for hire, he had not received the money he was promised. They highlighted the absence of the murder weapon, the fact that it had never been recovered, leaving a gap in the physical evidence that could have directly tied Samantha to the act. Randy's responses were steady, but not without flaws. He admitted he had not been paid. He acknowledged that the gun had been discarded, thrown into a body of water where it had never been found. He didn't attempt to present himself as reliable in a general sense. Instead, he focused on the specifics, the parts of his story that aligned with the evidence, the connections that could be verified. Teresa Martin's testimony added another layer, one that reinforced Randy's account while also introducing her own role in the events. She had already pleaded guilty to being an accessory, her cooperation with the prosecution part of the agreement she had made. Like Randy, her credibility was challenged, her motives questioned. But her story filled in gaps, particularly in the planning stages. She described overhearing conversations between Samantha and Randy, the discussions about the killings, the mention of money. She confirmed the text message that had been used as a signal, the coded language that had seemed meaningless until placed in context. She admitted to driving Randy to the area, to picking him up afterward, placing herself directly in the sequence of events that led to the murders. For the prosecution, this combination of testimony was critical. It wasn't just one person making an accusation. It was two individuals, each with their own involvement, whose accounts aligned in ways that were supported by physical and digital evidence. The DNA placed Randy at the scene. The phone records connected him to Teresa. Teresa's connection to Samantha bridged the gap that would have otherwise remained speculative. But perhaps the most damaging evidence came not from testimony, but from Samantha's own actions, specifically her digital footprint. When investigators examined her phone, they found searches that painted a picture of someone thinking about the aftermath of a crime long before it was publicly known. Questions about how quickly a double homicide scene could be cleaned. Inquiries about obtaining a passport in a short amount of time. Searches that explored whether someone could be suspected of murder without being charged. Even questions about whether God forgives those who commit such acts. Individually, each search could be explained away. Curiosity. Coincidence. But taken together, in the context of everything else, they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. They suggested forethought, an awareness of what might come, an attempt to understand the consequences before the act had even been carried out. The defense attempted to counter this by framing the searches as unrelated, as the kind of random inquiries people make without deeper meaning. They argued that there was no direct evidence placing Samantha at the scene, no physical link tying her to the act itself. They emphasized the reliance on testimony from individuals who had already admitted to criminal behavior, suggesting that their statements were shaped by self-interest. Samantha herself maintained her innocence. She didn't testify in a way that provided a detailed alternative narrative. Instead, her stance was consistent. She had not done this. She had not planned it. She had not asked anyone to kill her family. In the end, the case came down to how the jury interpreted the convergence of evidence. Not one piece alone, but all of it together. The motive, rooted in financial gain. The testimony, connecting her to the planning. The DNA, placing Randy at the scene. The phone records, linking the participants. The digital searches, suggesting awareness and intent. After deliberating for just 2 hours, the jury returned with a verdict.
Guilty.
The word carried through the courtroom with a finality that left no room for ambiguity. For some, it was a confirmation of what they had believed from the moment the charges were filed. For others, it was a shock that hadn't fully settled, a reality that felt difficult to reconcile with the image of the person they thought they knew. Samantha's reaction was contained, but those close to her felt the impact immediately. The sentence followed, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. There would be no second chance, no opportunity to rebuild outside the walls that would now define the rest of her life. Randy, already serving his sentence, saw little change in his own circumstances. His cooperation had not erased what he had done. At most, it adjusted the structure of his punishment, shifting consecutive sentences to concurrent ones. It was a technical difference, not a meaningful escape. For the family of Robert and Robbie, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but not resolution. Justice, in a legal sense, had been served. The people responsible had been identified, tried, and sentenced. But the loss remained, unchanged by the outcome. The courtroom emptied slowly that day, the tension that had filled it dissipating as people stepped back into their lives. But what had been revealed inside those walls didn't stay there. It followed them, into conversations, into quiet moments of reflection, into the way they would remember the Ford family and the story that had come to define them. Because in the end, the trial hadn't just answered the question of who was responsible. It had forced everyone to confront a deeper, more unsettling truth about how something like this could happen, not at the hands of a stranger, but through a plan that had been conceived within the very family it ultimately destroyed. Long after the courtroom had emptied and the headlines had faded into the background noise of newer stories, the echoes of what happened to Robert and Robbie Ford remained embedded in Horry County, not as a single moment of violence, but as something that lingered in the spaces people returned to every day. The Ford property still stood where it always had, surrounded by the same fields, the same quiet roads, the same rhythm of life that had once felt unshakable. But for those who knew what had happened there, the land no longer felt untouched. It carried memory now, not visible, not spoken aloud in every conversation, but present in the way people paused when they passed by, in the way silence settled differently in that place. For Robert's friends, especially those from the church where he had spent so much of his life, the loss wasn't something that could be neatly processed and put away. They remembered him in fragments, his voice in the choir, the way he greeted people without hesitation, the steadiness he brought into a room simply by being there. His absence wasn't loud, but it was constant, a quiet space that couldn't be filled by anything else. Robbie, too, existed in those memories, not as a victim defined by the way his life ended, but as a young man who had been on the edge of something new, someone whose future had been interrupted before it had the chance to fully take shape. Grief in a community like this doesn't always show itself in dramatic ways. It settles into routines, into the small changes people make without thinking. Conversations shift. Certain topics become harder to approach. There is a collective awareness that something fragile has been broken, something that once felt secure. The idea that violence could come from within, not from an outsider passing through, but from someone connected, someone known. That realization doesn't fade easily. For Samantha's children, The aftermath took on a different form, one that would unfold over years rather than in a single moment. They were young, too young to fully understand what had happened, but not immune to its impact. As they grew older, the story would become clearer, shaped not just by facts, but by the way others spoke about it, the way it was remembered, the way it was explained. They would have to reconcile two realities: the mother they knew and the person the court had determined she was. That kind of conflict doesn't resolve itself easily. It becomes something that has to be carried, interpreted, understood over time. There is a tendency, when a case like this reaches its conclusion, to look for a single explanation, something simple that can be pointed to as the reason it all happened. Greed is often the word that surfaces first, and in many ways it fits. The financial motive was clear, the structure of inheritance, the shift that would occur if both Robert and Robbie were gone. It provides a framework that makes the crime comprehensible on a basic level. But human behavior, especially when it leads to something this extreme, rarely exists in a single dimension. What happened here wasn't just about money. It was about perception, about how someone views their place within a family, within a system of relationships that may not feel balanced or fair. It was about decisions made over time, thoughts that weren't challenged, rationalizations that grew stronger the longer they went unexamined. The plan didn't appear overnight. It developed, piece by piece, until it reached a point where it no longer felt like an idea, but like a solution. That's what makes it unsettling. Not just the act itself, but the path that led to it. The fact that it didn't require a moment of uncontrollable anger or sudden impulse. It required patience, planning, the ability to separate emotion from action long enough to carry it through. For the investigators who worked the case, there was a sense of closure in identifying those responsible, in building a case strong enough to hold up in court. But closure in a professional sense is not the same as resolution on a human level. Cases like this don't leave clean endings. They leave understanding sometimes, but not peace. The use of forensic genealogy, the persistence in following leads that didn't immediately pay off, the attention to details that might have been overlooked in a less thorough investigation, these became part of the story as well. They demonstrated how modern investigative techniques can reach into places that once seemed inaccessible, how evidence that sits quietly for years can suddenly become the key to everything. But even that advancement carries its own weight, raising questions about privacy, about the balance between solving crimes and the boundaries of personal data. It's a reminder that every step forward brings new complexities alongside its benefits. In the end, what remains is not just the fact that justice was served, but the recognition of what was lost and how it was lost. A father who spent his life building stability for his family. A son who stood at the threshold of his future. Their lives didn't end because of randomness or chance. They ended because of a decision that valued something else more. And that is where the story lingers, not in the details of the crime itself, but in the questions it leaves behind. How well do we truly understand the people closest to us? What signs do we miss, not because they aren't there, but because we don't expect to see them? How does something that appears stable from the outside shift into something capable of this kind of destruction? There are no simple answers to those questions. There rarely are. But stories like this force them into the open, refusing to let them remain abstract. They take something distant and make it immediate, something unthinkable and make it real. In Horry County, life continues as it always does. The fields are still planted, the roads still stretch out under the same wide sky, the church doors still open every Sunday. But for those who remember, there is a layer beneath that normalcy now, a quiet understanding that even in the most familiar places, even among the people we believe we know, there are depths we may never fully see. And perhaps that is the most enduring truth this case leaves behind, not just that justice can be pursued and achieved, but that the line between what we believe and what is real is sometimes far thinner than we are prepared to accept. Time has a way of softening edges, but it never truly erases what has been carved into it. In the months and years after the trial, the story of the Ford family didn't disappear. It transformed. It moved from breaking news into something quieter, something people carried internally rather than spoke about openly. It became part of the identity of the place, a reference point that lingered beneath conversations, surfacing only when someone asked the kind of question that couldn't be answered simply. For those who had followed every step of the case, from the first discovery in the soybean field to the final verdict in the courtroom, there was a strange duality in what remained. On one hand, there was clarity. The sequence of events had been laid out, examined, challenged, and ultimately accepted by a jury. The people responsible had been identified and held accountable. The system had worked in the way it was designed to. But on the other hand, clarity did not bring comfort. Knowing how something happened does not make it easier to understand why it could happen at all. The Ford home, once a place of routine and familiarity, no longer held the same meaning. Even if its walls remained standing, even if its structure didn't change, its identity had been altered in a way that couldn't be reversed. Places absorb what happens within them, and some events leave marks that no renovation or passage of time can fully remove. For the community, it became less of a home and more of a symbol, a quiet reminder of how quickly normal life can fracture. People who had known Robert found themselves returning to small, specific memories rather than the larger narrative of his life. The way he laughed during casual conversations, the consistency of his presence at church events, the quiet reliability that had defined him. These were the details that mattered, the ones that resisted being overshadowed by the way his life ended. In remembering him this way, they reclaimed something that the crime itself could not take. Robbie, too, remained in those reflections, but his memory carried a different kind of weight. There was a sense of interruption, of something unfinished. Conversations about him often circled around what might have been, the career he was building toward, the independence he was stepping into, the life that had been just beginning to take shape. His absence wasn't just about what was lost, but about what never had the chance to exist. For Samantha, the reality of her sentence settled into something permanent. Life without the possibility of parole is not just a punishment measured in years, it is the removal of future in its entirety. Every day becomes part of a fixed outcome, a path that no longer branches or changes direction. Whatever thoughts, justifications, or beliefs had led her to the decisions she made, they now existed within that confinement, with no external space to escape into. The world she had once moved through continued without her, unchanged by her absence in the way it had been changed by her actions. Randy and Teresa, too, remained part of that aftermath, their lives defined by the roles they had played. Their cooperation, their testimony, their involvement, none of it erased what they had done. It simply positioned them within the narrative in a way that allowed the full story to be told. Their consequences, like Samantha's, became part of the larger outcome, a reflection of how deeply the crime had extended beyond a single decision or a single moment. But beyond the individuals directly involved, there was a broader impact that couldn't be measured as easily. Trust, once shaken, doesn't return to its original state. In communities like Horry County, where familiarity forms the foundation of daily life, the idea that something like this could emerge from within that familiarity changes how people see one another, even if only in subtle ways. It doesn't create constant fear, but it introduces a quiet awareness, a recognition that not everything is as visible as it seems. That awareness doesn't have to lead to suspicion or distance. In some ways, it does the opposite. It encourages attention, presence, a deeper engagement with the people and relationships that might otherwise be taken for granted. Because if there is anything this story makes clear, it's that the most significant moments are often not the dramatic ones, but the ordinary ones that pass without notice until they're no longer there. In reflecting on everything that happened, it becomes difficult to separate the crime from the context that allowed it to unfold. The planning, the motive, the execution, they are all part of the story, but they don't exist in isolation. They are connected to human choices, to perspectives that shifted over time, to a series of decisions that, at each stage, could have gone in a different direction. There is a tendency to look for a moment where everything changed, a single point where the path became irreversible. But in reality, it is rarely that simple. More often, it is a gradual progression, a series of smaller steps that lead towards something larger. By the time the final decision is made, it no longer feels like a sudden leap, but like the continuation of something that has been building all along. That is perhaps the most difficult aspect to confront. Not just that the crime happened, but that it was possible in the first place. That the circumstances, the thoughts, the motivations aligned in a way that allowed it to move from idea to action without being stopped. And yet, within that reality, there is also something else. A reminder of the importance of awareness, of connection, of paying attention to the things that don't always demand attention on their own. Not because doing so can prevent every tragedy, but because it creates space for understanding, for intervention, for the possibility that not every path has to lead to the same outcome. As the story of the Ford family settles into its place in memory, it leaves behind more than just the details of a crime. It leaves questions, reflections, a sense of responsibility to look more closely at the world we move through and the people who share it with us. It challenges the idea that familiarity equals safety, while also reinforcing the value of the relationships that define our lives. In the end, what remains is not just the knowledge of what happened, but the recognition of what it means. Not in a single, definitive lesson, but in the quiet understanding that stories like this are not distant or abstract. They are real, shaped by real people, real choices, and real consequences. And in that understanding, there is a kind of clarity, not one that brings comfort, but one that invites reflection, ensuring that what was lost is not reduced to a moment, but remembered as part of something larger, something that continues to resonate long after the final chapter has been written. There is always a moment, long after the verdict is read and the case is closed, when the story stops belonging to the courtroom and begins to belong to memory. It no longer unfolds in evidence exhibits or sworn testimony, but in the quiet spaces where people try to make sense of what remains. In those spaces, the facts don't change, but their meaning begins to shift, stretching into questions that no legal process is designed to answer. For the people who lived closest to the Ford family, the passage of time did not create distance so much as it created contrast. Life resumed its rhythm, as it always does, but it carried a different weight. Familiar roads were still driven, familiar faces still seen, but there was an awareness beneath it all, something unspoken that had altered the way those routines felt. The idea that tragedy could emerge not from chaos, but from something carefully planned within a family, left a kind of imprint that didn't fade easily. In conversations, the story was rarely told from beginning to end. Instead, it surfaced in fragments. Someone would mention Robert, and the focus would shift to the way he lived rather than how he died. Someone else would bring up Robbie, and the discussion would linger on his ambitions, the direction his life had been taking. These fragments became a way of preserving something essential, a refusal to let the violence define everything that came before it. But even in those moments, there was an undercurrent that couldn't be ignored. The knowledge of how it ended remained, shaping the way every memory was held. It introduced a kind of duality, remembering who they were while knowing what had been done to them. Holding both at the same time is not easy, but it is often the only way forward. For those who followed the case closely, especially investigators and legal professionals, the story took on another layer over time. It became something to study, not just for its outcome, but for the path it followed. The way the investigation unfolded, the role of forensic genealogy, the significance of small pieces of evidence that ultimately became central, these elements turn the case into an example of how modern methods can intersect with traditional detective work. Yet even in that context, there was an acknowledgement that no amount of technique or expertise can fully account for the human element. The choices that led to the crime were not technical problems to be solved. They were decisions shaped by perception, emotion, and rationalization. Understanding them does not mean justifying them, but it does require recognizing that they emerged from a place that cannot be measured in the same way as physical evidence. Samantha's role in all of this remained the most difficult to process for many. Not because the evidence was unclear, but because of what it implied about the nature of trust and familiarity. She had been part of the same environment as the victims, shared the same history, the same connections. The idea that someone so closely tied to that foundation could orchestrate its destruction challenged assumptions that people rely on every day. It raised questions that extended beyond the specifics of the case. How well can anyone truly understand the thoughts and intentions of another person? At what point does internal conflict become something external, something capable of causing harm. These are not questions with definitive answers, but they are ones that linger long after the details of the case have been absorbed. For Samantha herself, the reality of her situation became more defined as time passed. The structure of prison life, the repetition, the absence of choice, these are conditions that reshape a person's experience of time. Outside, years move forward with change, with new events, new relationships. Inside, they accumulate differently, marked less by what happens and more by what is not. The life she had once constructed, with its routines and responsibilities, became something that existed only in memory, inaccessible in any practical sense. Randy and Teresa, too, remained part of that broader narrative, their lives continuing under the consequences of their involvement. Their decisions, like Samantha's, had set in motion a sequence of events that could not be undone. Cooperation and testimony may have altered the legal outcomes in certain ways, but they did not erase the actions themselves. Those remained, fixed in the story, inseparable from the result. As the years move further away from 2018, the case begins to take on a different kind of presence. It becomes less immediate, less tied to the specifics of dates and proceedings, and more connected to the lessons people draw from it. Not lessons in the sense of clear instructions, but in the way it shapes perspective. It becomes a reference point, something that influences how people think about trust, about family, about the unseen complexities in relationships that appear stable on the surface. In that sense, the story does not end with the final chapter of the trial. It continues in the way it is remembered, in the way it is told, in the way it is used to understand other situations that may never reach the same level of consequence, but share similar underlying tensions. It becomes part of a larger conversation about human behavior, about the conditions under which people make choices that lead to irreversible outcomes. And yet, for all of that broader meaning, there is something deeply personal at the core that should not be lost. 2 lives were taken. A father and a son who existed beyond the circumstances of their deaths, who had their own histories, their own relationships, their own significance in the lives of those around them. Remembering that is not just an act of respect, but a way of maintaining balance in a story that could otherwise be consumed entirely by its most violent elements. In the quiet moments, when the details of the case are no longer being actively discussed, that is what remains most clearly. Not the investigation, not the trial, not even the motive, but the recognition of loss. The understanding that something meaningful was removed from the world, and that its absence continues to be felt in ways that are not always visible. There is no resolution that can fully account for that. Justice, as it exists within the legal system, addresses responsibility. It establishes accountability. It creates a formal conclusion. But it does not restore what was taken, and it does not answer every question that arises in the aftermath. What it does offer is a boundary, a point at which the search for answers transitions into something else, a process of reflection, of memory, of attempting to integrate what happened into a broader understanding of life and human nature. It is in that space that the story ultimately settles, not as something that can be neatly concluded, but as something that continues to resonate, quietly shaping the way it is remembered and the way it is understood. There is a point, long after every fact has been examined and every voice has been heard, when a story like this settles into something quieter, something that no longer demands attention but continues to exist beneath the surface of everything that follows. It becomes less about what happened and more about what it revealed, not just about one family or one community, but about the fragile architecture of trust, expectation, and human nature itself. The Ford case, in its final shape, does not end with a single lesson neatly tied together. Instead, it leaves behind a series of reflections that resist simplicity, asking more than they answer. What stands out most is not the violence, but the contrast between what was seen and what was hidden. From the outside, the Ford family represented something familiar. Faith, routine, connection, the kind of life that feels stable because it follows patterns people recognize and rely on. That familiarity becomes part of how people understand the world. It creates a sense of predictability, a belief that certain boundaries exist and will not be crossed. When those boundaries are broken, especially from within, the impact extends beyond the immediate loss. It challenges the assumptions that made that sense of stability possible in the first place. The idea that harm comes from strangers is easier to process. It allows for distance, for the belief that danger exists somewhere else, beyond the circle of people we know. But when the source of that harm is connected, when it emerges from relationships that are supposed to offer safety, the narrative shifts in a way that is much harder to reconcile. It forces a confrontation with uncertainty, with the understanding that familiarity does not always equal transparency. And yet, it would be too simple to reduce everything to distrust. If anything, cases like this highlight the importance of awareness rather than suspicion. They remind us that relationships are complex, that people carry internal struggles that are not always visible, and that those struggles, when left unaddressed, can grow in ways that are difficult to anticipate. This is not about assigning blame beyond the individuals responsible, but about recognizing the environment in which decisions are made, and how easily those decisions can become disconnected from the values that once guided them. Samantha's story, when viewed in its entirety, is not just about a single choice, but about a progression. A movement from dissatisfaction to justification, from thought to plan, from plan to action. At each stage, there were opportunities for that progression to stop, to be questioned, to be redirected. But instead, it continued, reinforced by its own logic, until it reached a point where the consequences became irreversible. Understanding that progression does not excuse it, but it does illuminate how something unthinkable can become, step by step, something that is carried out. There is also a lesson in the way the truth was uncovered. The investigation did not succeed because of a single breakthrough or a moment of clarity. It succeeded because of persistence, because of the willingness to continue looking when answers were not immediately available. The cigarette butts left behind, the DNA profile that sat without a match, the eventual use of forensic genealogy. Each of these elements played a role, but none of them alone would have been enough. It was their combination and the time invested in connecting them that ultimately brought the case to its conclusion. That process reflects something broader about justice itself. It is not always immediate. It is not always straightforward. Sometimes it requires patience, the ability to hold onto a question long after it stops producing easy answers. And even then, what it provides is not closure in the emotional sense, but resolution in the legal one. It defines responsibility, but it does not heal loss. For the families involved, for the community, for everyone who followed the case, that distinction matters. Closure suggests an ending, a point at which something can be set aside. But stories like this do not end in that way. They become part of the ongoing experience of those who were touched by them, shaping perspectives, influencing how future events are understood. At the same time, there is a responsibility in how these stories are remembered and retold. It is easy to focus on the most dramatic elements, the details that shock or disturb, but doing so can overshadow the human reality at the center. Robert and Robbie Ford were not defined by the way their lives ended. They were defined by the lives they lived, by the relationships they built, by the presence they had in the world around them. Keeping that perspective intact is essential, not just for their memory, but for maintaining a sense of balance in how the story is understood. The same applies, in a different way, to the broader narrative. Reducing the case to a single concept, greed, betrayal, crime, risks oversimplifying something that is inherently complex. It removes the layers that make it meaningful, that allow it to be examined in a way that goes beyond surface-level interpretation. True understanding requires holding those layers together, even when they are difficult to reconcile. As time continues to move forward, the immediacy of the case will fade, but its presence will not disappear entirely. It will remain in the way people reference it, in the lessons they draw from it, in the quiet awareness it leaves behind. Not as something that defines the community, but as something that exists within it, a part of its history that continues to inform its perspective. And perhaps that is where the final reflection rests, not in trying to extract a single meaning, but in accepting that some stories exist as reminders rather than answers. Reminders of how fragile certainty can be, of how important it is to remain attentive to the complexities of human behavior, and of how the consequences of a single decision can extend far beyond the moment in which it is made. In that sense, The story of the Ford family does not conclude with the final chapter of the trial or the final sentence handed down in court. It continues quietly, in the way it is remembered, in the way it shapes understanding, and in the way it underscores a truth that is both simple and difficult to accept, that the line between what we believe is possible and what is real is not always as clear as we would like it to be.